They gave me the shovel detail because nobody else wanted it. That is the honest beginning of this story. There is no great destiny in the assignment, no prophecy whispered in the warden's ear the morning he handed me the work chit. Sector 7, Sublevel 9, debris clearance, 20 meters of collapsed tunnel adjacent to the first seal chamber. Report to Overseer Duvesh by the 6th bell. Bring your own gloves if you have them. I had them. Worn leather, cracked at the knuckles, a pair I had been nursing since my second year inside Lauren Station. I tucked the chit into my breast pocket, pulled on the gloves and went. I should tell you about Lauren Station first, because it matters for understanding the scale of what happened and the distance between what I was and what the gate said I was. Lauren IV is the third moon of the gas giant Lauren in the interior system, a place of moderate climate, thin atmosphere requiring supplemental respiration gear in the open, and rock formations that have been valued by extraction companies for 200 years because of the unusual density of mineral deposits in the lower strata. The moon itself is not remarkable. The station is not remarkable. A standard medium-security labor facility run under contract with the Catherine Mining Combine, housing somewhere between 300 and 400 inmates at any given time, with a staff of VETH overseers, a human administrative corps, and a rotating contingent of Combine security. The food is adequate. The accommodations are cells of 8 square meters with a cot, a shelf, and a narrow window that looks into a utility corridor rather than outside, because the outside is bare rock and thin air, and there is nothing to see. The work is steady, and the days have a rhythm that is monotonous in the way that is almost a comfort when you have been in a place long enough and have stopped fighting it. I had been at Lauren Station for 3 years and 4 months by then. My crime, if you want to call it that, was the kind of thing that sounds enormous in the charging document and small in the retelling. I had been a surveyor for the Catherine Mining Combine on a contract dig at an outer belt site designated HL9. I was good at the work. 11 years of field survey, 3 planetary classifications, 2 mineral assessments that had come in ahead of schedule and under budget. I knew how to read rock. I knew how to move through a dig site without destroying what was below the surface you were clearing. That skill is rarer than it sounds. The site HL9 had turned up pre-combine infrastructure, old tunnels, sealed chambers, a corridor that our instruments said was dense with something that wasn't rock and wasn't ore. Standard protocol required us to flag it to the archaeology division and hold the site pending review. The review process took on average 8 to 14 weeks. Our contract had a quarterly bonus clause tied to output tonnage. Our foreman, a man named Reth, did the arithmetic and decided the delay would cost the Combine its quarterly target, and through that, his own supplemental compensation, and through that, whatever he had planned to do with the money. He ordered us to proceed. I filed the objection, once in writing through the standard channel, twice verbally, directly to Reth, in front of the crew chief and 2 of the senior surveyors. The 3rd time I refused the direct order in front of the full morning assembly. Reth had a particular way of giving orders, low voice, flat eyes, the absolute certainty of a man who has never had a subordinate hold the line, and I had the particular way of refusing that comes from 11 years of knowing what happens to sites when you don't respect what's underneath. We looked at each other across the assembly floor, and neither of us moved. He had friends in the Combine's legal division. I did not. The charges were obstruction of licensed extraction activity and willful interference with contracted operations. My file noted a pattern of insubordination. Reth's testimony noted my history of filing non-binding objections, which the prosecution characterized as a pattern of deliberate friction rather than good faith compliance. My testimony noted the standard protocol and the potential heritage significance of the site. The magistrate noted that standard protocol contained a foreman's discretion clause for time-sensitive contracts, and that my objection, while noted, did not constitute sufficient grounds for halting operations. 4 years at Lauren Station, minimum security, I could have received worse. I had served 3 years and 4 months. I had 7 months and some days remaining. I was not counting the days. Counting days in a place like Lauren Station is a form of self-inflicted misery that I had decided early on to avoid. I was doing the work I was assigned, reading in the evenings, staying out of the disputes that erupted periodically among the longer-term inmates over resources and perceived slights, and the small territorial conflicts that boredom generates. I was, by any reasonable assessment, unremarkable, a convict with skills that made her useful on careful extraction details. A woman who read the station, library's archaeology and geology holdings in the evenings, because the entertainment screen was showing things she had no interest in. The reading is how I knew about the first seal. The first seal chamber was not, technically, part of the station facility. It had been there long before the station, long before the Combine, long before the first survey ship of any species had mapped this moon. The seal was a gate, a massive circular door set into the bedrock of sublevel 9, the lowest accessible level of the facility, approximately 40 meters below the main extraction floor. It was composed of a material that every analysis in 400 years of recorded contact had classified as non-standard alloy of undetermined origin, which is the analytical equivalent of saying it was made of something nobody had seen before and nobody could replicate. It was roughly 8 meters in diameter. Its surface was covered in incised radial glyphs arranged in concentric rings from edge to center. The glyphs had never been successfully translated. The gate had never been opened. The recorded history of attempts was long and, I thought, rather educational about the nature of ambition and its relationship to evidence. The Veth had found the seal first, approximately 400 years ago by their own reckoning, and the registry noted this was probably conservative, since the Veth source documents had described the seal as already old when they first mapped the site. The Veth colonial period was methodical and engineering-focused, and they had approached the seal with the tools they trusted: 5 of their best resonance analysts and a pair of acoustic hammers large enough to be classified as construction equipment. The theory was that the seal was a pressure-locked door, sealing a pressurized chamber, and that the correct vibrational frequency applied at sufficient amplitude would trigger the release mechanism. They had applied 17 different frequency signatures over a period of 6 weeks. The gate had not responded in any measurable way. They had eventually cataloged the site as inert, built a relay station nearby. The relay was the seed of Lauren IV's orbital infrastructure, which was how humans had ended up running the interior operations, and moved on. The Catherine Empire had come next, 2 centuries later, in their administrative expansion period. The Catherines were tall and blue-gray and intensely organized, and they had brought 17 scholars and a device they called the Resonance Codex, which was supposedly capable of translating the vibrational signature of any sealed artifact into something readable. The Codex had been their signature instrument for their entire colonial period. It had cracked 11 other pre-Catherine sealed sites in the outer belt. When applied to the first seal, it had produced 17 pages of output. Every page was blank. The Catherine record noted this in the same clinical tone it used for everything, which was either an administrative virtue or a failure of emphasis depending on your perspective. The Doran had been there before the Catherines, or at least their cultural memory of the site predated the Catherine administrative records, though the Doran's own archiving practices were not linear in the way that produced clear chronology. The Doran were something between a civilization and a religion. Their political and spiritual structures were fully integrated in a way that made separate analysis meaningless. They did not approach the seal with engineering or scholarship. They approached it with faith, which in the Doran sense meant 12 of their most devoted practitioners stationed at the chamber for 9 years, singing a tonal sequence in continuous rotation. The Doran record, which I had read in translation in the station library, noted that the seal had felt, to their most sensitive practitioners like something that was listening, not responding, not opening, but listening with a quality of attention that their notation described as ancient patience. The Doran had ultimately withdrawn, and their records classified the seal as a site of ongoing spiritual significance awaiting its proper time. Humans had been on Lauren IV for 40 years. 2 University of Deln expeditions, a joint combine heritage survey, and a private team funded by a collector in the Outer Belt whose name the registry had redacted. None of them had gotten a response. The most recent University of Deln report, filed 11 years prior, had used the phrase likely permanently inert in its conclusion. A permanent substation maintained by the university had 2 resident researchers at Lauren who published occasional papers on the seal's material composition and glyph patterns, papers that had, over the past decade, grown shorter and more cautious in their claims. I found all of this genuinely interesting. The seal was, by any measure, an extraordinary object. Something had built it with purpose, with sophisticated design, with materials that remained unanalyzed 4 centuries on. Something had sealed it. 4 centuries of attempts by multiple species with different technologies and different philosophies had produced nothing. Either the door had no mechanism that could be triggered by any method anyone had tried, or the mechanism was of a category that no one had yet understood. I had a third theory, which I kept to myself because I had no evidence for it, and because Lauren Station was not a place where speculative theories about ancient seals were likely to find a receptive audience. My theory was, the mechanism was the right person. I had this theory because of the book. My grandmother had given me the book the year I turned 18. She had said, "The name is old." She had said, "It is older than the Combine, older than the Catherine administrative period, older than anything I can point you to in a standard history." She said it the way she said all important things, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, but with the steady insistence of someone communicating a fact that they need the listener to retain. She was a small woman, my grandmother, practical in all things. She grew tomatoes in clay pots on her balcony, which is one of those details that lodges in memory with the force of something essential. She kept meticulous household records. She read widely and without particular system, following curiosity wherever it led. She had been, when I was a child, the most sensible person I knew. The book was handwritten, in a script I could read because she had taught me to read it when I was young, presenting it as a kind of game, a family code, the way some families teach children to read a second language for practical reasons. The script was a version of early human colonial notation mixed with something older that she could not identify, and that I had never found a linguistic match for in any academic database I had searched. It was not difficult script, once you knew the letter forms. The vocabulary was precise and functional, maintenance language, keeper's language, the way someone writes when they are documenting a set of duties that need to be clear rather than beautiful. The book described the warden of the first seal. It described the role in terms of responsibilities rather than history. The warden held the right to open the seal from the outside and the right to close it from the inside. The warden alone could authorize passage through the seal in either direction. The warden's recognition by the seal was hereditary and could not be transferred, replicated, or delegated. The gate's mechanism was keyed to the bloodline, not to any token or credential or ceremony. The roll passed through the maternal line, because the record said so and gave no further explanation, and I had learned to trust the record's practical specificity even when it didn't supply its reasoning. The warden was not a ruler, not a warrior, not a priest. The warden was a keeper of a door. The record was very clear about this distinction, and I had thought about it many times. Not an inheritor of power, not a chosen champion with authority over whatever lay beyond the seal. A keeper. The door needed a hand that knew it, and the warden's bloodline was that hand. My grandmother had not known what door the book described. She had passed it to me because her mother had passed it to her, and her mother before that, a chain of women who had kept the record of a role that none of them could execute because none of them had ever found the seal. The book did not describe the seal's location. It described its function, its operational requirements, the specific circumstances of the warden's recognition, and the weight of the responsibility. The address was missing. The roll was intact. I had spent a fair amount of time, in the first year of my sentence at Warden Station, reading the xenoarchaeology holdings with the seal specifically in mind, checking descriptions against the book's account of the gate's properties. The book mentioned the radial glyph pattern in terms consistent with what the Deln reports described. It mentioned the material's unusual properties in language that predated the analytical vocabulary the reports used but pointed at the same qualities. It mentioned the gate's long history of refusing unauthorized contact, not in those words, but in the functional language of a keeper's record noting what the lock did not respond to, as context for what it did respond to. I had a strong suspicion, which I had told no one, that the first seal of Lauren IV's sublevel 9 was the seal that the book described. But suspicion is not the same as confirmation, and I had no standing to present my theory to the heritage liaison or the university researchers. And even if I had, I was a convict on a debris clearance detail, and not obviously the sort of person whose theories about ancient lock mechanisms warranted serious institutional attention. I kept the book in a lockbox in my quarters. I went to work. Sublevel 9 was cold. The station's heating systems were calibrated for the habitation levels and the extraction decks, but the lower survey corridors ran on minimal climate control, and the bedrock held a chill that rose through your boots if you stood still long enough. I had learned to keep moving. Overseer Duvesh was a Veth, one of the older ones, thick-shouldered, his gray skin carrying the deeper color that meant decades rather than years, the kind of Veth who had seen enough on enough different sites that he had cultivated a particular quality of calm attention. He ran his details with minimal instruction and maximal expectation, which I respected. He did not explain things you should already know, and he expected the work done to a standard that he himself would hold to. I had worked under worse. He pointed me toward the rubble pile and gave me a 4-hour assignment window, then went to stand at the observation post at the far end of the corridor where he had a small heater and a folding seat, and a reader tablet he consulted more or less constantly. I did not begrudge him the heater. The rubble was a partial ceiling collapse from a stress fracture in the corridor linking the maintenance tunnel to the seal chamber's antechamber, the approach corridor that had been constructed during the University of Deln's first expedition, which had built out a small amount of infrastructure before running out of answers and funding. The collapse was not dramatic. Chunks of processed stone, the old Veth relay station subfoundation material, dense and dark gray, mixed with finer debris, some cable housing, a section of corroded pipe that had probably been there since the relay station period. The collapse had blocked access to the antechamber approach, and per the work assignment, needed to be cleared enough for the university's ongoing monitoring equipment to be serviced. I worked methodically, surveyor's habit, assess the pile's geometry before you touch it, identify what is load-bearing and what is loose fill, determine the sequence that creates the least risk of secondary collapse, start from the edges and move inward. Do not create new problems trying to solve old ones. The cold helped. In a way, it focused you, kept the body engaged while the mind worked through the geometry. It took me the better part of 2 hours to clear the outer pile down to manageable depth. I moved the mid-sized pieces by hand and stacked them in the cleared section of the corridor according to material type. The Vethira processed stone separate from the more recent monitoring infrastructure components, because they needed to go to different disposal categories, and mixing them created paperwork. Small details like this mattered in a facility environment. The work had its own satisfaction, the satisfaction of a thing done correctly in the correct order. What remained after the outer pile was a wedge of larger stone pieces that had settled against the antechamber's interior wall, the wall nearest the seal chamber itself. The wedge was tight. The largest pieces were at the bottom, held in place by their own weight against the wall, and removing them required working from the top down, freeing the upper stones first to reduce the load bearing on the lower ones. I worked the wedge carefully. The iron pry bar Duvash had left in the equipment cache was useful for the mid-sized pieces. The larger stones I rolled once freed, moving them in stages to the clear corridor section. The last stone was the problem. It was lodged at the base of the antechamber wall, directly against the threshold where the antechamber met the seal chamber's approach corridor, the boundary marker that previous teams had laid to indicate the line beyond which no unauthorized access was permitted. The stone was heavy, dense old Veth process material, maybe 1.5 meters in its longest dimension, set at an angle that made prying it difficult because there was no good fulcrum point. I tried the bar from the left side. The stone moved fractionally but didn't break free. I tried from the right. The same result, movement without release, the stone shifting in its socket of rubble but not clearing. I stood back and assessed. The efficient solution was to push the stone flat rather than try to lever it out sideways. If I could get it lying flat against the floor, it would be clear of the threshold and the rubble detail would be complete. I needed to brace from the wall opposite to push with enough force. I stepped forward to position myself, one hand on the stone to gauge its resistance, the other reaching for the wall behind me for purchase. My right hand found the stone. My left hand went to the wall, and the wall was not the antechamber wall. The collapse had displaced the threshold marker stones. Without noticing it, working by the feel of the floor and the position of the rubble, I had stepped through the antechamber's broken boundary into the seal chamber's first approach. Not far, a single step, perhaps less, but my left palm was flat against the face of the first seal. The difference was immediate. Not warmth, not a vibration exactly, though there was something in the category of vibration, a harmonic, very low, far below the threshold of hearing but present in the bones of my hand and wrist and forearm as a kind of felt sound. Like placing your palm against the hull of a ship whose engines are running very deep and very distant, so deep and distant that you would never hear them, but the contact tells you they are there and they are running purposefully. A resonance. Something enormous that had been, until that moment, perfectly and completely still. I did not pull my hand away. I will be honest about this. I am not a mystical person. My grandmother was not a mystical person. The book she had passed to me was not a mystical document. It was a keeper's record, practical and specific, and I had read it as such. But the sensation beneath my palm was not threatening. It was careful, deliberate. It had the quality of a very precise instrument taking a very precise measurement, the quality of a process that knew exactly what it was looking for and was currently in the process of determining whether it had found it. Whatever was behind that surface was examining my hand with the same careful attention that I would bring to reading a drill core sample. Not invasive, not urgent, not interpretive. Exact. It was gathering information. I thought about the book in that moment. The book said the gate's recognition was not a ceremony and not a performance. It said the gate assessed through contact the way any calibrated instrument assessed, by reading precisely what was there. I had always imagined this as a metaphor. It was not a metaphor. It was a description of a mechanical process, which the book's author had understood and recorded in the functional vocabulary of a keeper. The instrument was reading me. I stood still and let it read. There is a particular quality to being assessed by something extremely old and extremely precise. It is not the same as being watched by a person, which carries intent and emotion and all the noise that conscious observation brings. This was cleaner. Whatever was behind the gate had a question with a specific answer, and it was determining, calmly and without hurry, whether the answer was present. I was either what it was looking for or I was not. The process would give a result, and the result would be definitive. I had been told, in effect, my whole life that I might be what this gate was looking for. I had kept the record. I had done the reading. I had formed the theory, which I had not shared with anyone, that the first seal of Sublevel 9 was the gate the book described. And yet, standing with my palm flat against its surface and the deep harmonic running up my arm, I was struck by the degree to which I had never quite believed it. Not fully. You can keep a thing and read a thing and form a theory about a thing, and still hold some portion of yourself back from the full weight of it. The same way you can stand at the edge of a very large drop and understand intellectually how deep it goes, and still not have surrendered your body to the knowledge. The gate had no patience for the held-back portion. It was reading all of me, not the part I offered deliberately. The glyphs came slowly. They had been described in every report I had read, the Deln expedition notes, the Catherine registry, even the Doran spiritual accounts in translation, as faint incised lines, visible to the careful eye, offering no translatable script and no measurable output. What I saw was different in degree rather than kind. The lines were still incised. They had not changed in physical form, but they were filling, not with light, or rather, not only with light, with density, presence, the weight that matter has when it is operating at its full specification rather than merely existing. The glyphs were becoming more fully what they had always been designed to be, as though they had been suppressed or withheld or simply waiting for the correct input, and the correct input had now been provided. They moved outward from my palm. I want to be precise about this. The precision is important to me. The way precision in a survey reading is important, because the details are what makes the difference between a record that means something and a record that is only approximately accurate. The activation did not erupt. It did not bloom in a sudden burst or cascade outward with any kind of urgency. It moved at the pace of something that has already decided and is now doing the expected, orderly work of implementation. The innermost ring of glyphs directly beneath my hand came first, filling over perhaps 15 seconds from dormant incised lines to channels of pale violet light. Slow, deliberate. The next ring out, slightly cooler in color, more purely blue-violet, less warm. Then the next ring and the next, the activation spreading outward across the gate's surface in steady, evenly spaced concentric waves. Each ring took the same amount of time as the previous one. The intervals were identical. This was not a random light show. This was a sequence running at its specified rate, delivering each step in its correct order at its correct time, the way a calibrated instrument runs through its startup protocol, every stage completing before the next begins, every output within the expected parameters. Someone had designed this. Something had been built to run exactly this sequence, for exactly this kind of contact, and after 400 years of waiting, it was running it without error. I heard Duvesh behind me. He had not said anything, but the heater had clicked off. I heard it in the sudden additional silence, and then the folding seat scraped against the corridor floor, and then his boots on the stone. The Veth have a particular cadence when they walk, a slightly heavier emphasis on the left heel that is a biological characteristic rather than a habit. In the quiet of Sublevel 9, with the gate sequence running its slow spreading light and the deep harmonic rising in my hand, I could track exactly where he was by sound. I did not turn around. I kept my left hand flat against the gate's surface. My right hand I brought slowly back from the stone, letting my weight settle onto my own feet rather than borrowing against the rubble. I stood straight. I kept my breathing even. The gate did not feel like something that needed a reaction from me. It felt like something that needed me to be still and allow the recognition to complete itself. The violet light from the innermost rings had warmed slightly as it spread. Not quite gold, not quite amber, something between them. The color of very old metal when you remove centuries of tarnish and the original surface finally shows for the first time. The color of a thing being itself again after a long time of being obscured. The outer rings were still dark but moving toward active. the activation front spreading at its measured pace. I thought about the Catherine Resonance Codex and its 17 blank pages. I thought about 9 years of Doran tonal prayer and the feeling of ancient patience their practitioners had reported. I thought about the Veth resonance hammers, barge-sized instruments, pressed against this same surface I was touching with a cracked leather glove. All of them had brought the best tools their civilizations could assemble. All of them had applied force and technique and faith and calculation. None of them had been wrong exactly. They had simply brought the wrong kind of access. The gate was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a lock. Locks do not open for cleverness. They open for the key. I was the key. My grandmother had been the key. The line of women before her, whose names the book preserved in its dry keeper's notation as a list of those who had held the record and passed it forward, had each been the key. None of them had found the lock. I had found it by reaching for a wall. Duvesh stopped a few meters behind me. I could hear his breathing, the deep-chested controlled Veth respiratory pattern, but faster than the baseline he usually maintained. He was not panicking. Duvesh was not a man who panicked, but he was processing something that exceeded his current model, and his body was responding to that fact. "Sen," he said. His voice was very precise. "Sir," I said. "Your hand, leave it exactly where it is." "Yes," I said. "Do not move, do not speak to it, do not do anything." "Understood," I said. I had not been intending to do any of those things. There was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds, during which the activation front reached the outer edge of the gate's third ring from the perimeter, and the harmonic in my hand deepened perceptibly. Then I heard Duvesh tap his communicator. Once, twice the sequence for an open administrative channel, the station-wide frequency. He spoke in Veth, quickly and precisely, which I understood well enough from 3 years of daily proximity. He said, "The first seal is showing activation." He said, "Human contact." He said, "Full glyph sequence running." He said, "I need the heritage liaison at sublevel 9 immediately." He said, "I need researcher care." He said, "Get everyone who needs to see this down here now, because I don't know how long it will last and I need witnesses." The communicator traffic after that was fast, and I caught only fragments. Cores, the heritage liaison, acknowledging from the administrative corridor. She was not on duty, but she was in the building. Kerv, the university substation researcher. I could hear the particular alert sharpness in his response, the quality of a man who has been waiting for exactly this signal for years and does not trust himself to believe it until he has confirmed it with his own eyes. Station security requesting a status. Duvesh telling them hold position, non-emergency, stand by. I kept my hand on the gate. The outer rings were approaching active now. The 4th ring from the center was lit. The 5th was brightening. The color gradient across the gate's surface had settled into something I could describe. Deep, saturated violet at the outermost activated edge, cooling toward a clearer blue-violet in the middle rings, warming back through the near-amber tones at the center where my palm rested. The combination was not theatrical. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to function, and what it communicated was function. This is a working mechanism. This is a mechanism currently operating at specification. This is a mechanism that has found what it was calibrated to find. The harmonic had deepened again. It was in my shoulder now. Faint, not uncomfortable, but unmistakably present, the resonance of something large engaging its full capacity from a long rest. I heard the elevator in the maintenance shaft, well above us, engaging. The heavy mechanical sound of the car descending, more than one person. The footsteps when the car arrived, multiple sets, different gates. Core's precise, efficient tread. Kerv's longer stride, the heavier step of the security pair. The sound of them reaching Duvesh's position and stopping. Duvesh's low voice in standard telling them to hold at the threshold. The murmur of their response. I was aware of all of it at the edge of my attention. It was peripheral. The gate had most of me. The harmonic had reached my collarbone by now, a resonance so deep it was felt rather than heard, and the light from the fully activated outer rings was brightening the corridor behind me even without my seeing it. I could tell by the quality of shadow at my feet, the way the ambient illumination of the sublevel had changed. Something that had been dark for 400 years was putting out light, and the corridor was responding to it, the way any space responds to a new source of illumination. Simply, without drama, the shadows rearranging themselves. I thought about what Kev must be seeing from the threshold. 3 years of observing a dormant surface, and now this, every glyph active, the full radial pattern running in a color sequence that his reports had described as theoretically possible and never observed. I thought about Cores and what her institutional position required her to do with the next hours and days. I thought about the Combine's bureaucratic machinery and the Heritage Division's regulatory authority and the joint jurisdictional claims of half a dozen other bodies whose interest in the first seal had been, until approximately 6 minutes ago, academic. None of it changed what was happening. The gate did not care about jurisdiction. The gate cared about one thing and had just found it. The last outer ring activated. Every glyph on the gate's visible surface was lit. All of them. The full radial pattern, edge to center, burning in that violet to amber gradient, a complete working system, all systems go, not one element still dormant. The gate looked, for the first time in 400 years of recorded contact and however long before that, like what it was. A functional mechanism, currently operating, serving its designed purpose. The harmonic in my arm changed again. The single deep note that had been building through the activation sequence, the startup tone of something large coming online through an orderly progression, became more complex. Not music, not quite, but the kind of layered resonance that means more than one system is simultaneously active, the way a ship's engine note changes when secondary systems engage and the fundamental and the harmonics begin to interact. The gate was doing something more than finishing its activation. It was entering a second phase. I have thought carefully about what I believe those two phases were. The first was identification, the gate reading the contact against whatever criteria it had been built to hold, assessing whether the hand on its surface was what it had been calibrated to receive. The slow spread of glyphs, the careful harmonic, the precise sequential activation, that was the reading. The second phase was confirmation, the gate having completed its assessment, marking the result as verified, executing the response. The complex layered resonance I was now feeling, that was the confirmation. It lasted approximately 40 seconds. I counted them without particularly meaning to, the surveyor's habit of marking elapsed time, keeping track of intervals, maintaining awareness of duration as a data point. Then the gate went quiet. Not dark. The glyphs held their full illumination, all of them, the complete radial pattern, the deep violet at the edges and the warm amber at the center, steady and unwavering, with a quality that was different from the activation phase. The activation had been dynamic, building, spreading, doing the work of recognizing. This was settled. This was a state of completion. The gate had finished the work it had set out to do, and the result was this. Everything lit, everything confirmed, everything held in the stillness of a system at rest after correct operation. The harmonic dropped out completely. The silence in sublevel 9 was enormous. I became aware of my own heartbeat. I was aware of Duvesh's breathing behind me, and the Heritage Liaison's sharp, involuntary intake of breath from the threshold, and the absolute focused stillness of everyone in the corridor. All of them holding the specific quality of still that comes not from discipline, but from the understanding that something is happening and any interference might end it. The gate surface changed. The illuminated glyphs reconfigured. The incised lines did not physically move. The carved stone held its form precisely. But the pattern of which glyphs were emphasized, which channels ran brightest, shifted in a way that I recognized even without linguistic training, even without any formal preparation for this specific moment. The pattern reconfigured the way a display changes when it runs a different function on the same hardware, the underlying structure unchanged, but the active output reorganized to express a new instruction. New groupings, new emphasis. The central cluster contracted. The glyphs that had been displaying the full radial activation sequence collapsed inward to a smaller, denser arrangement. A tight gathering of symbols that I recognized from the Deln expedition notes I had read in the station library, as formally distinct from the query pattern and the dormant pattern and the activation pattern that researchers had cataloged. This was a declaration pattern. The researchers had described it as hypothetical, a theoretical fourth state that they had predicted based on the grammar of the other three but had never observed. I was looking at it. It was real. The gate spoke, not with sound as the only vector. The words arrived in two ways at the same instant, as a vibration through my hand and arm that my body translated into meaning before my conscious mind caught up. The way you understand the word stop before the processing has finished, the way urgent meaning precedes the parsing of it, and simultaneously as a sound, low and layered, resonant in a way that used the full acoustic volume of the seal chamber as its instrument, not from a single point. From the chamber itself, the stone walls and the vaulted ceiling and the bedrock floor. The gate had a voice the way a cathedral has a voice. Everything in the space participated. It said, "First Warden, the seal is yours." 7 words. They were addressed to me with a precision that was not figurative, not a general declaration directed at the air or the universe. The address was mine. The gate had identified me, and the address was mine specifically, the way your name in a crowd of names finds you before you have consciously heard it. The glyphs pulsed once, a single slow exhalation of light that rolled from the center outward to the edge, like a breath, like a heartbeat, like the final confirmation of a system that has completed its operation and arrived at rest. Then the light steadied, still, complete. Behind me, from the threshold, I heard cores make a sound I cannot adequately describe. It was not a gasp. It was the sound of a person whose entire professional framework for understanding a thing has just been replaced, and who has not yet had the time to build the new version. The sound of a structure revising itself under load. I heard the Veth scholar, Kerv, say something in formal Veth. I caught fragments, 400 years, the registry, a phrase that I knew from the Doran records, the bloodline designation, the term for an inherited appointment that runs through a family line without requiring the family's knowledge, a role that maintains itself through the biology of descent, regardless of whether anyone in the line knows the role exists. I had read that term in the Doran's account of the seal, and had noted it without being able to place it at the time. I could place it now. I did not turn around. I kept my hand on the gate. I needed another moment with it, with the silence after the 7 words, with the settled certainty of the illuminated pattern. The gate had said what it needed to say. I needed a moment to receive it fully. Here is what I knew, standing in that moment, with the gate's warmth in my palm and 7 words still resonating in the bedrock around me. My grandmother's book described the first warden. It described the role's responsibilities with the practical specificity of a keeper's record. It described the gate's mechanism as a bloodline key, that the gate was calibrated to a single hereditary line passing through the maternal descent, and that no other mechanism would serve. The book did not say where the gate was. The book had never been able to say where the gate was, because none of the women in the Sen line had ever found it, and so none of them had ever been able to add the address to the record. My grandmother had grown tomatoes on her balcony and kept the book in a flat cedar box under her bed and passed it to me at 18 as though she were passing me a useful tool, because that is what she understood it to be. Her mother had passed it the same way. Back and back, women who kept a duty without knowing the address of the door. I was a convict on a debris clearance detail in a minimum security labor facility on the third moon of a gas giant, and I had stepped through a broken threshold marker while trying to shift a stubborn stone, and I had put my left hand on the wrong wall. The gate had been exactly where it needed to be. I turned around. Duvash was 3 meters away. He had lowered his arm from the threshold, the instinctive gesture of containment he had maintained since the beginning, the barrier that had held the others back. He was looking at me with the expression the Veth use when they are revising a significant assumption about something they had believed settled, a particular quality of stillness, the face not tense but very alert, the slight widening of the deep-set eyes that, in a Veth, means processing, not surprise, because surprise is a thing Veth consider undisciplined and processing is a thing they consider proper. Kors was just behind Duvash. She was a small woman, methodical and precise in all her movements, the kind of person who handles irreplaceable things with both hands and full attention and never rushes. She was holding her assessment tablet in both hands and not looking at it. She was looking at me with the particular attention of someone who has just had their model of a situation replaced and is rapidly constructing the new one. Kerv was at Kors' shoulder. He had been at the Lauren substation for 3 years, compiling what I understood to be an exhaustive catalog of every measurable property of the SEAL's dormant state, a project that had increasingly become, as I read it in the library, an exercise in documenting the absence of results rather than the presence of them. He was a long-faced man, careful and precise, the kind of scholar who outlasts his more excitable peers because he never lets his investment in an outcome distort his record of the evidence. He had a portable scanning unit in his left hand and a transcription case under his right arm, and he had moved to the front of the group with the focused purposefulness of a man who has been waiting for a specific event and has determined not to waste any part of it. He was the only one of them who did not look surprised. He looked like a man receiving confirmation of something he had theorized for a long time but had almost abandoned. The line held, he said, not to me, to himself or to the record or to the 3 years of patience it had cost him. Through all of it the line held. The 2 security officers were behind the researchers, looking at each other and then at Duvash, and then at me with the expression of people whose threat assessment frameworks have encountered something outside their design parameters and are waiting for a senior officer to tell them what category this belongs to. Duvash, with the particular Veth motion that I had come to know as the professional equivalent of at ease, a slight settling of the shoulder, a fractional release of the weight he had been holding, told them silently to stand down. "Sen," he said. "Sir," I said. "Do you require anything?" It was such a precise and careful question. Not what is that or what does it mean or what are you? Operational, practical, do you require anything? 3 years and 4 months of working together on extraction details and in maintenance corridors, and Duvash had distilled it to exactly the right question. "Not immediately," I said. He nodded once and looked at the gate, and nodded again. A different nod, slower, the acknowledgement of something he was filing permanently in a category marked witnessed and confirmed. Kors had finished a call on her communicator. She came fully into the chamber, stepping with the deliberate care of someone entering a space that has just been definitively reclassified from inert heritage site to active operational environment. She stood beside me and looked at the gate for a long moment, at the full illuminated radial pattern, at the declaration cluster burning in its tight configuration at the center. "How long have you known?" she said. Her voice was professional, steady, the question of someone who needs an accurate record. "About the book, since I was 18, I said. "About this gate specifically 8, maybe 9 minutes. She absorbed this. The Combine Heritage Division will need a full statement. "I know. The University of Delm, the Veth Antiquities Authority, The Doran continuance has a standing heritage claim on this site. They'll need to be notified separately. They describe the gate as listening, I said, in their records. Their practitioners said it felt like something that was listening with ancient patience. Coors was quiet for a moment. They were right. Yes, I said. Kerv had moved past both of us and was running his scanner across the declaration cluster at the gate's center, his transcription case open, making notes in a rapid shorthand. He scanned in silence for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he said, without looking up, I need access to whatever primary documentation you have for the bloodline designation. The book, I said. You can read it, I keep it. He looked up at that. He studied me, not the way people study a curiosity, but the way a careful scholar recalibrates his understanding of his own primary sources. The book he had not known existed was suddenly the most important document in his research corpus, and I had just told him, clearly and without qualification, the terms on which it would be accessible. He recognized the terms as the Warden's terms. He nodded. There were going to be hearings, I knew. Institutional processes, the long machinery of documentation and jurisdictional authority that converts a private event into a public record. My sentence had 7 months remaining. I did not know what a recognition of this kind would do to the remainder of it, whether it altered my classification, whether it had bearing on the original charges, whether any of the bodies that Coors was cataloging had jurisdiction over a person in my category. These were administrative questions, and they would work themselves out through the ordinary administrative channels. What I did know was that the book described this period, not specifically, not Lauren Station or the Combine or my particular sentence, but the period after a warden's recognition was one the record had accounted for. It said, there will be those who want to claim the warden's authority for their own institutional purposes. It said, the warden holds the door, not the political weight of those who want access to what lies beyond it. It said, in its plain keeper's language, remember that the gate answered to you and not to them, and conduct yourself accordingly. My grandmother had underlined that passage. In ink, in a steady hand, the underlining of someone who considered the instruction important enough to mark. I had thought about it many times over the years. I thought about it now, with Coors composing her report and Kerv scanning, and the full weight of several species' institutional interest about to descend on Sublevel 9, and I understood what my grandmother had understood when she drew that line. The warden was not a political figure. The warden was not an asset to be managed or a credential to be deployed. The warden was a keeper. The door was mine. The rest was noise, and I had been keeping it at arm's length my whole working life, and I intended to continue. What I knew was the gate. What I knew were the 7 words. What I knew was my grandmother's book, and her tomatoes, and the cedar box under her bed, and the practical seriousness with which she had handed me something whose full purpose she could not explain. What I knew was every woman before her in the Sen line, each of them first warden of a seal they could not find, each of them keeping a record for a door they never stood before, each of them trusting that the keeping was right even without the address. The gate held its light. The declaration pattern ran in the cool, deep silence of Sublevel 9, unhurried, unwavering, a system at rest in its confirmed state after a very long wait. Above us, the station continued its ordinary operations, cargo processing, habitat maintenance, shift rotations, meals in the common room. The universe had not been interrupted. Nothing visible had changed. But the oldest lock in the sector had a warden again. I had a worn leather glove on my left hand and a pry bar in my right, and a shovel resting against the wall 3 meters away. I had come down here to clear rubble on a Tuesday and go back to my 8-square-meter cell by the end of shift. I had a 7-month sentence and a lockbox in my quarters, and a book that my grandmother had given me as a useful tool. I had stepped through a broken threshold marker and put my left hand on the wrong wall. The gate had always known this was how it would happen. Not the details, not the station, not the sentence, not the shovel. But this, that the warden would arrive without announcement, without ceremony, without any of the institutional apparatus that 4 centuries of empires had thought the door required. She would arrive doing ordinary work in a cold corridor, and she would place her hand on the gate the way you place your hand on a wall for balance, and the gate would do the rest. 400 years of patience, 7 words, done. I looked at the gate for a long time. I did not feel elevated. I did not feel transformed. I felt more than anything seen the way my grandmother had made me feel, handing me the book when she said, "This is yours, take care of it." Like a thing that had been true about me for a long time had simply been acknowledged by something that had been waiting to acknowledge it. Not a gift, a confirmation. I thought about the women, all of them. A line stretching back beyond the oldest dates in the book, back to whoever had first been given the responsibility and had first written it down in the plain practical script that I had learned at my grandmother's kitchen table like a family game. Each of them had carried the duty of a door they could not find, in a galaxy that had no particular interest in what they carried. Each of them had kept the record and passed it forward in the faith that the keeping itself was the right thing to do, that the address would be found when it needed to be found, that the warden would arrive when the warden was supposed to arrive. Not blind faith, the practical faith of people who understood that some mechanisms run on timescales longer than any individual life, and that your part in such a mechanism might not be the part that gets to see the result. You keep the record, you pass the book, you trust the line. The line had held 400 years, every empire, every hammer and codex and prayer. The line had held through all of it, invisible and unrecognized and patient, passing from woman to woman in families that had no idea what they carried. Until a Tuesday in sublevel 9 and a broken threshold marker and a hand reaching for the wrong wall. I thought that would have pleased my grandmother, the manner of it. She would have found the shovel funny in her quiet way. The duties were what they were. The door was mine to hold, not as a title, not as a reward for surviving Reth or Lauren Station or anything else the years had put in front of me. As the thing I had been from the beginning, the end of a long chain, the hand the lock had been built for, the warden arriving at last in a cold corridor with a shovel and a work chit and worn leather gloves. That was enough. It had always been enough. The gate knew it, and now so did I. I picked up my shovel from where it leaned against the wall, not because I intended to use it, the rubble detail was thoroughly concluded, but because I had set it down when I reached for the wall, and it seemed wrong to leave it on the floor of the first seal chamber. I held it in both hands. Kors was composing her report. Kerv was scanning. Duvesh was standing at the threshold with the air of a man who has witnessed a great deal across a long career and has just added the most significant item to the record. The gate blazed in the cold. Its light was patient and steady and certain, the way a kept promise is steady, not urgent, not demanding, simply there, still true after everything. The first warden had come. The seal was hers. That was enough. That had always been enough.